Hello and welcome to the SMU Video Archive series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of the university, especially from the perspective of their time here. I'm James Brooks, and today we have with us John McCarthy, a retired faculty member from the Department of Biology. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Jim.
John, just to set the stage, why don't you talk about, you came here from graduate school at Purdue from your PhD. Why don't you pick up and talk a little bit about the university as you first knew it, and the department and the university as a whole?
I was somewhat surprised when I came to find out how collegial the group were. It seemed to be very much concerned for each other and for the students and for the faculty. And I was amazed at my first faculty meeting. I had thought that there would be some tremendously deep discussions, which there were, but I remember one instance in which Larry Perrine of the English department was concerned about where a period would go in a certain sentence. But more important things were discussed, and it amazed me that the faculty seemed actually to run the university, that the provost, Temple Hosford, would come and put a proposal before the group, and the group were really running the college. The space was small, the facilities were small, limited. Biology was limited to the top floor of Fondren Science and to a few labs in the basement, and we had to wait until the geology department moved onward to get some additional space. But it was an interesting group. And
refresh my memory, you came in the
year 1958.
I was thinking late 50s.
Yeah.
And at that time, what is now Dedman College was the College of Arts and Sciences.
That's correct.
And its meetings were, as you say, very often highly procedural.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about your colleagues in the biology department, because I knew them not nearly as well as you did, but since we were in the same building and shared interest in paleontology and biology and so on, I knew them perhaps better than I would have if I'd been in the Department of English.
Yeah. Well, Elmer Cheatham was chairman at the time. He was a parasitologist and an excellent teacher, and kept up with research and worked with the pest control group to identify pests in the area. He had a habit of getting to the office very early. I think he went to deliver papers with his son, or drove the son, and he would get to the office about 6 o'clock. He'd start a pot of coffee, and by 8 o'clock civilized time, it was pretty potent. And he taught a very exciting course for students in the freshman biology program. And one of the interesting events was he would have a help session for students before an 8 o'clock exam, and they would have to come at 7 or earlier. And this was a trial that was more felt by the co-eds than by the males who came. They didn't care what they looked like, but the young ladies were pretty disheveled as they arrived. Bill Stallcup was teaching genetics and evolution courses, and very active, had worked in genetics of birds. And one of the points that pleased me is that Bill, in his early years, taught some extra courses for his family was increasing in size, and he had to give up some of his research, or at least slow it down. And sometime in the late 80s or early 90s in a Scientific American, I was reading an article on speciation in birds, and the author cited the pioneering work of William B. Stallcup of Southern Methodist University. It made us really proud and showed that he was doing a lot more than just teaching, and he was a tough teacher.
I'm sure he was.
Yes.
You had some other colleagues, Lloyd Chinners and Joe Harris.
Joe Harris and
Maine Longnecker.
Maine was dean of students, and taught one course in introductory biology, and advised students. And he was a wonderfully droll individual with humor that was somewhat subtle, and He would say, so he was in World War I, and he would say, compared to World War II, he said it wasn't much of a war, but it was the best we had at the time, and that hid his feelings somewhat. Maine did not drink alcohol when he was dean of students, and I discovered that he said when he had to enforce a rule, no drinking on or off campus for students, that he would follow a rule that he didn't think was necessary. He followed it himself until he left the dean's office.
What about Joe Harris? Was Joe dean? No, he was not dean.
He was not dean. He was a faculty member teaching embryology and comparative anatomy, and a jovial individual who seemed more interested, or very interested, in helping high school teachers. And he and others had succeeded in attaining National Science Foundation grants, for high school teachers, and there would be in-service and summer courses for high school teachers. And somewhere in the early 60s, Joe and others started a summer program, one of the first to offer master's degrees to high school teachers. And it was a truly rigorous program. Teachers came here for 6 weeks and took 2 or 3 courses with lab and had seminars. And it was pretty hard. And the second year that the course was offered, the participants were invited back for the continuation of their master's degree. And one of the common statements by each of them was, "Oh, I didn't expect to see you here." They didn't think each other would come back, but most of them stayed for the 3 years, and many of them earned a master's degree. Mm-hmm. So Joe was pretty good in that.
He was a pioneer in that.
Pioneer in there. And eventually he went on to be dean, and when Maine Longnecker left, he was advisor for the pre-meds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then you had Lloyd Chinners.
Lloyd Chinners. Lloyd was in charge of the herbarium and taught a course in botany, and I would say that Lloyd was a fairly stern taskmaster, and he could alienate a class in just a few seconds. He would take his students, he would ask them what newspaper they read, and if someone said, well, it was the Dallas Morning News or the Bowie Times, he would deride them. They should be reading the New York Times. But he was quite able, spoke several languages, and he came down with diabetes. And I had several books on diet and diabetes, which I forwarded to him. And he discovered that he could still drink his 1 Budweiser beer a day with diabetes, and we became fast friends after that. And he would have my wife and I join him on an outing to a Chinese restaurant where he had designed the menu for the individuals. Lloyd was not faithful, though, in taking his insulin shots with food, and there are several times where he took the insulin and then drove to work, became hypoglycemic, and drove into the brick wall behind the library. Mm. But he got along quite well, but eventually he succumbed to the diabetes.
Well, I've always thought that it was remarkable what he accomplished, because he worked essentially in the unair-conditioned attic of Foundry Science Building and built a world-class herbarium.
Actually, he did. It's amazing what he did. And then it was moved to I think it was when the Science Information Center was built.
It was moved to the basement there. And that is the herbarium that now reposes at the Botanic Research Institute of Texas, BRIT, in Fort Worth. And it still is SMU's property, but it is on indefinite loan, as I understand it.
Yes, and it's being handled very well and being quite productive. Lloyd would be quite proud of the work they've done, perhaps better than we could have done at SMU.
Well, actually, I've always thought that, and this is for anybody in systematic biology, it's perfectly logical, but he also, in addition to a world-class herbarium, he built a world-class library to support it.
Yes, he did.
Mostly out of his own pocket.
Yeah, it's astounding.
Yes, yes. Yeah. I remember when I was provost, we had somebody from the University of Michigan here to evaluate the herbarium and the library, and he was absolutely astounded because it was better than Michigan's holdings.
It's amazing.
That's a tribute to Lloyd.
Yes, he showed a number of manuscripts from early times.
Yeah. Well, you had one other colleague who may have been retired by the time you came, but he was very much a presence.
Very much a presence. Samuel Wood Geyser had retired 2 or 3 years before I came in 1958. And he was a wonderful individual, truly a scholar, but bizarre in activity. He called everybody dear boy. And when we came, when I was here early on, of course, salaries were low and one had to be conservative. And even more so in Sam's times, you had to be frugal.
Right.
And Sam Wood has a habit of coming into offices and looking in the trash cans for old manila envelopes or pieces of string or mimeograph paper or whatever. And it didn't matter if you were talking with someone, a faculty member, student, visitor. Sam might come in and say, "Oh, dear boy, excuse me," and he'd head straight for the trash can and take a few things. He approached the exit to the door with vigor, and he had a cane, and you might be walking up to the door, and suddenly this door would explode with a cane right in your face, and Sam would walk out saying, "Dear boy." And
Well, I remember one episode that you perhaps have heard about, but Elmer Cheatham organized a retirement party for Sam, and it was supposed to be a surprise party. But picking up on what you were just talking about, Elmer had failed to take into account the fact that Sam went through trash cans, and he discovered extra copies of the invitation to the event. And then he had a major problem because he felt that he should produce a manuscript for this occasion, which he proceeded to do, and it almost ruined the whole evening.
I was not here at that time, but that was great. We do know about how his interest in anatomy, and I know of an individual who sent him a journal marked Journal of Human Anatomy. Turned out to be a Playboy magazine, which Sam got great amusement out of.
Comparative anatomy, so to speak.
Yes.
One other geyserism I remember very well. For some reason, I was down at his house down on Haney, and he took me out to the garage to share a huge accumulation of fruit jars. He thought I needed a few fruit jars, and so I was given those, but I observed when I was there 2 very large, probably 3 feet in diameter balls of used string because Sam would simply add one piece of string to the next. And I don't know what happened to those after the house was closed.
I don't know either, but that's just a sign of the frugality of those days.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you know, you started out by talking about the university when you came, and I certainly experienced the same thing when I came a few years earlier, because it really was, in the best sense of the word, still a very good small college.
Yes.
At that point, and it had the faculty collegiality across departments, and you probably remember, at least having heard about, communications between, fun communications, but posed in very serious language between such characters as Geyser and Herbert Gambrill in history,
Yes.
and I.K. Stevens in philosophy, and Humphrey Lee, who was president, and Hempel Hosford, who was provost. And all of this carried on through campus mail with the utmost seriousness. And it's a different time. That would not happen now.
Oh, no, it wouldn't. And was that when the made-up university was invented by Herbert Gambrill?
Yes, Martha Sumner University.
Yeah.
This was, as I recall, was under the during the presidency of Dr. Selectman, for whom many of the faculty about whom many of the faculty had some concern, because he was not a scholar, he was a minister, and the fact that he probably saved the university during the Depression was irrelevant in the comment that I'm about to say, because he was viewed as an anti-intellectual. And so this same group of faculty that we were talking about organized Martha Sumner University. If you do that, it's SMU reversed.
Yeah.
And that faculty continued as long as Herbert Gambrill was alive.
Yeah. Herbert was
the mover.
For those sorts of things, yeah.
What about we've begun to talk a little bit about the university at that time. Why don't you talk a little bit about your impressions and so on. You've referred to faculty meetings and so on. Did you have other impressions about
Yes,
where SMU was at that time?
It was heavily into teaching and at least not much into research in the area that I was involved with, cellular biology before the molecular age. And when I came, I found that there were 3 pieces of research equipment that actually were purchased by Bill Stallcup on a grant, and they were used for 30 years easily. And it was several years before I got a grant. And there was no summer teaching, so I went to Oak Ridge, Tennessee twice, 2 successive summers, and those proved to be quite an advantage for me to get research going. And the university was somewhat helpful in starting my own research work with some seed money. Nothing compared to what they give now. I think it was a modest $1,000 in those days, and it bought quite a bit. It turned out that I was not being as successful as I thought I should be. I had won a National Institute of Health grant and had a technician, and I applied for a postdoctoral study in steroid biochemistry, which I did receive, and that was in about 1964-65. And I went to Worcester, Massachusetts, to the Worcester Foundation and Clark University. And it seemed to me that about that time the university was beginning to change, to grow a little and become a little more mature. I believe at that time I had written back to SMU for something about my grant and got a response from Levan Griffiths, and I said, oh, they now have a research director, a project manager, and so the maturity was coming with bureaucracy. And we lost a little of our closeness, but gained a more maturity for both students and faculty. Pardon me. And the teaching load was decreasing somewhat, and research was going. I should mention that one of the attractions at SMU when I first interviewed was the coming of what was to be a graduate research center at SMU. And it sounded to me that this was a very promising event for teaching and research. And shortly after I got here, Claude Albritton was leading the drive for progressing with this graduate research center. And it turned out that instead of having it housed at SMU, it became an independent entity, and much to SMU's, I think, distress. And now it's the University of Texas at Dallas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that period, I guess, starting the period you've just been talking about, starting in, as I recall, the early 60s.
Early 60s.
And the decade of the 60s was a period of the beginning of real transformation in the university. And that's what you're alluding to.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was about that time that the first PhD program was created in the university in the Department of Economics.
Right.
As you mentioned, Claude Albritton, who had been Dean of Faculties of Arts and Sciences, had in this reshaping that was associated with the master plan, the well-known master plan, Claude had moved into a position of graduate dean.
That's it.
And many of these developments, including the Science Information Center, the Science Library, were a result of those early years.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, you were in a department that was still building, and so was I at that point. And talk a little bit about how some of the stresses and strains, as you may have observed them, that happened as a result of changing this comfortable little organism
to
what the then chaplain would call a show-enough university.
Show-enough university, yes. It was a more intense pressure on research, not publish or perish yet, but research came to the forefront, and that did upset a few people in biology who didn't have any research objectives. and but it never came to a true problem. I was amazed that someone like Elmer Cheatham or Maine Longnecker were really pushing me to, not forcibly, but encouraging me in a very positive sense to be more productive in research and get grants and that sort of thing. At that time, there came an emphasis to hire people on the faculty who had more modern training. When I came, the faculty were primarily systematic or biologists or natural history individuals, and so they sought people in cell biology and that sort of thing. And we had a number of people come and go. One of the interesting ones was Bill Zebrin, who came to us from Southwestern Medical School. He came over and talked to me, and he was interested in being more involved in teaching. And so in the year that I was in Boston, or in Massachusetts, Bill had started and unfortunately suffered a massive heart attack and died. But that led to our seeking the young lady who had been his technician. She had done electron microscopy. We had written a grant to get an electron microscope, and it was Vanita Allison, who retires this year, who came to us first as an electron microscopic technician and later as a instructor and later as a professor of biology after she got her PhD. So it was a fortuitous encounter. We also had a lucky event. When I was in Massachusetts, I went to one of the national meetings, and there was a fellow who was featured as an important speaker whose name was Ron Estabrook. And he worked with the cytochrome's P450 enzymes, which was the first time I'd heard about them, though they were involved in my area. When I got back to Dallas, I discovered that Ron had come to the Southwestern Medical School to be chair of biochemistry, and I went to one of his lectures, his first lectures, that was at University of Texas at Dallas, and we talked, and we have been fast friends ever since. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, but has been very good to SMU and to our faculty members. He's invited me to work in his lab, and at one point he led the Tager course in biochemistry that was offered over television. So,
talk a little bit about you brought up Tager, and this is something that you were heavily involved in. I was a little bit. But it was an important and quite frustrating experience for a decade or a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades.
As I recall the events, Loyd Berkner became the director of the Graduate Research Center of the Southwest when essentially SMU's hopes were drifted further away to north of Dallas. And there became an association of centers, and Tager is the Association of Graduate Education and Research. Yeah, and members of each department formed a committee, and I was on the Tager Biology Committee, and we were to design some useful event for all of the schools in the area, from TCU, Austin
College.
And can't think of the name in Fort Worth besides TCU. Anyway, Texas Wesleyan. And we would meet periodically, and there was the representative from what is now UTD was very firm in, he was chair, to have a curriculum that would be imposed on all member institutions. And I thought it was a very good idea to have a uniform curriculum, or at least a curriculum. But I said I doubt that we would be able to convince presidents that they should take the biology committee's decision as final. I was the only dissenter, but I was correct. But out of that came some television courses. And in my own naive way, I was questioning whether television teaching would work until I saw the first few minutes of the first lecture. And I became convinced that this was a very powerful tool. Well, there came to be a Tager biochemistry course And it evolved by myself and people from TCU trying to offer television jointly. It was a time when lecture space or studio space was limited in the engineering school, and so for a semester I drove to Fort Worth to lecture to SMU students on television. And it turned out to be quite good, a little inconvenient for me, but it was a good program. Eventually, several schools came together to offer that television course, and Ron Estabrook, as chair of biochemistry at the medical school, offered to head up the program. And that was good because he had no vested interest. And we had the advantage of the television people at UT Southwestern, and I believe the gentleman who was engineer of this program was there at the time, and it was a very effective group. They told us suggestions on how to teach, and it was a remarkable program.
I saw it being, by that time, getting involved in administration. I saw it from the administrative side, and I think there's no doubt that you're right, that it is a powerful tool and could have had significantly more influence in the area if it had been approached from an institutional politics direction that was different than the one that was taken.
Well, the problem, I think, comes to when equals came to direct the course, someone from SMU should have no more authority than someone from Texas Wesleyans, for example. And so there were some disagreements, and there were some inept lecturers, and I think that was finally its undoing.
There was also a significant problem about disparity in grading standards.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't know whether you want to talk about that or not.
Well, apparently, without naming any names, there were some, whoever was the lecturer gave the exam. The quizzes or the exams were sent to the lecturer for grading, and it were graded on a uniform basis. When the grades got back to a college, to the respective department, then some of those grades were changed.
Yes, that's what I was alluding to.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the point at which, I think this is by now we're into the 70s.
70s, yeah.
And that was the point at which, and I was then provost, that I began to try to seriously disengage us,
That's
except in very selective areas.
Yeah.
And it was very, very unfortunate that happened.
Yeah.
And even more so that those whose grades, original grades were changed to higher ones, were told about it.
Oh.
That caused real heartburn.
Yes, it did. It was interesting that my associates at the medical school felt that they could always tell when papers came from SMU, that the students were very able quality.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that without getting too far down this road, probably we were clearly an institution that was on a parity quality-wise with the med school.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased from a chauvinistic and egotistical point of view that was the case.
Yeah. Well, there's some other things about the Tager group that was unfortunate in that there was some of the people who became faculty members or scientists at Tager gave the impression that anyone who had been in this area before they came was inferior, and that they were there to save us and would help us in any way they could. I can recall one meeting where some associates of that former institution offered to review the grants of people at SMU, and that was not taken very kindly.
Well, unfortunately, that reflected to some extent the personality of Loyd Berkner.
Yeah.
Whose motivations I think were quite laudable, but whose interpersonal skills sometimes were left a little bit to be desired.
Yeah. Because subsequent to that, we've had very good relations with what were then the scientists and then now the faculty members at UTD. And interestingly, I was invited to be an outside reviewer on the promotion of one of the people there. So they were quite good scientists.
Yeah, and from the point of view of geology, and when we started the PhD program in geology, Anton Hales was the chairman of the geoscience group at UTD, GRCSW then, Graduate Research Center of the Southwest. And Anton was a real colleague, and he made sure that the rather impressive faculty of about 6 individuals that he had put together came and joined us as colleagues, and on an absolutely equal basis. We operated all the while that before they became affiliated with the University of Texas and got into all of the bureaucracy of the UT system. We were co-equal colleagues. We met one month here and one month at their facility, and so it was a good concept, but like a lot of good concepts,
it was hard to work.
It was hard to keep it working. I don't want to get much further down that road. You brought up the med school, and you've had a long and very productive and effective relationship with the med school, and joint programs and various other things of the sort, and that in some senses kind of spins out from the Tager thing.
Yes.
Why don't you talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that I've always been very pleased that SMU has done has been to try to reach out to other institutions and form collegial efforts.
Yeah. Well, we've tried to do that with the medical school and with Texas Christian University, and have had some success with both. Of course, much of this was the time before computers and television and internet, and things were harder to do. You had to move from one place to the other. And so it was rather easy to move with the medical school. And we had I've had research associations there, but it's been somewhat difficult to have academic associations because we were a private institution, and they were charged with dealing with other public institutions as UT Arlington. But they've been very collegial to us. Now I have not been much involved. There is a STARS program and a situation where students interested in biological research can come to SMU and then be affiliated with the medical school for research, and perhaps have a leg up on admission to the graduate program there. And I think that's quite a good program. I don't know how far it's gone. Christine Buchanan at SMU is in charge of that. That was one of our wonderful hires. I can recall in those days we were looking for a microbiologist, and it turned out that Christine's husband, George, is a pediatric oncologist, and he was being recruited by the medical school. We were recruiting a microbiologist. That was Christine Buchanan, so it was a wonderful, fortuitous operations for both institutions. And so we hope a lot more will come of that. She's directing that program with the medical school.
Well, that leads nicely back to where we started. We talked about the early biology department. Like a number of departments at SMU, in fact, probably at this point, most departments, the biology department has undergone a significant change through time, evolution through time. Talk a little bit about that, because while I could have told you and did mention most of your colleagues when you first came, I couldn't tell you who your colleagues now are.
Well, that's true. In one of the times that I was chairman, we were beginning to recruit, and we recruited a young man named Alan Fiducia, who was sort of a successor to Bill. He was an ornithologist interested in genetics and evolution. Alan was one of the most exciting people that we were recruiting, and I can recall getting a call from John Ublacher, and John was the parasitologist successor to Elmer Cheatham. And he'd been with us several years, and he called from the restaurant at Love Field and said, "We're ready to hire him now." We were all enthused, even before we had interviewed a subsequent candidate, and we were able to get Alan Fiducia. And we interviewed Raj Sohal at the same time, who was embryologist, cell biologist, and he did join us. Alan we kept for several years, and he was recruited away by North Carolina. And someone said, "You're not trying to keep Alan. You're not trying to offer him enough to induce him to stay." And I said, "If North Carolina offered you a position, would you leave?" And he said, "Yes." So that was a sad loss. And of course, Raj was here. I think he meditated on the mountain. After 2 years that he was here, he went to Colorado, and he said he sat in a stream on a rock, and he meditated on where his future, in science should be, and he discovered it was going to be in aging. So he began work on aging in the housefly, and he progressed greatly. He was receiving international attention, and he was recruited away from us last year by the University of Southern California Medical School.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, I remember very well Raj's presence, even though it might not be immediate. You always knew that Raj was about because there were always flies around.
There was always flies, and he said then they were never his. And I would say to him, "It's good that you're working on flies, but no one needs an old fly."
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you had other interesting colleagues too.
Yeah. Well,
you mentioned Vanita.
Vanita is solid, stable, worked on the electron microscope, and has been in cell biology and histology for many, many years. She and others were here when we were recruiting a new chair, and we had several people to interview, and this was the era of Frank Sogandaris. And Frank had been at Tulane, was at Montana, where I knew several people, and came to us as departmental chair. Frank has the interesting, unfortunate, and I shouldn't say that, humorous genetics of being Hispanic. He was from Panama, and his background was Greek. I always said that was explosive because he, like Raj, is very opinionated, and nothing happens quietly with Frank. He was able to work with us and get us a new electron microscope. He set up the cooperative program we had with Baylor Medical Center in Dallas, where we had some joint faculty appointments, some good combined research, and that led to our getting a PhD program. And that was quite good, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Frank was a very interesting and forceful individual in his interpersonal relations as well as interinstitutional matters. Yeah. And I remember very well that he was very concerned about the threats to human well-being of dog feces, and had at that point the president of the university was seen to be walking his dog on campus one morning, and that set off a real series of chain reactions.
Yes. I think that also is when Frank Balch would bring his whippets on campus, that Frank was also victimized by
Sogandaris?
By the other Frank.
Well, now, your department now has some of those same characters. Christine Buchanan, John Ubelacher is still there. You have other colleagues, and you will be moving soon into the new Dedman Life Sciences building.
Yeah. Well, that evolved as Frank withdrew from being chair. We had John Ubelacher was present, Raj was present, Vanita was working. Bob McAllister was here as physiologist, and he was doing a magnificent job in teaching physiology. He later left us, and then it was time to recruit again for an outside chairman. I had been chair, Chris had been chair, and we brought in Dennis Smith from Emory. Dennis was a Drosophila geneticist, and we had several people working with Drosophila. And since there was a turnover of faculty at this time, Dennis was able to bring in some new people. Larry Rubin, who is a parasitologist, what we now call a molecular parasitologist, And this was the time we changed from cell biology to molecular biology. Larry works on some molecular work of calcium transport with sleeping sickness. Very able lecturer, good researcher, and gets along well with students. Bill Orr came to us, and he works with fruit fly genetics also. Since then, we were able to recruit Rick Jones, and he also is in the molecular genetics area. So this is the stage in which people are moving much more heavily into research, lots of successful grants, and yet still active in teaching and working with students. And one of the interesting things through all these years have been students as undergraduates in research. That's been a push in the department virtually from the time I came till now. It's even more formalized now, and the students are doing much more dramatic things in their research work. When I came, there were these 3 pieces of equipment on the 3rd floor of Fondren Science. I work in the medical school on occasion where there's every possible piece of equipment for molecular biology. And I tell people who come here to look at a job that we don't have those items in every lab, but we have them. And there's nothing that you would be hindered from doing in molecular genetics or molecular biology by what's available at SMU. Intriguingly, in my own time, I've moved from what was enzymology or that sort of biochemistry into molecular biology and learned a little cloning technique. I was talking with some people in this center before we started this television, and Travis Jordan lured me into a program of going to computer education. And I attended a program and became converted to the use of the computer in teaching. It's just a powerful tool. And so to look over the years and see that we can now go from an idea of a manuscript to a finished product able to be published from computer work to the time when there was the manual typewriter and carbon copies and ditto for making copies. It's an amazing change.
Not to mention mimeograph machine.
Not to mimeograph. Well, we had not. We came up to the mimeograph machine later in the time. We were limited to ditto. And the advantage, I told someone that many of my important memos as chair were written in ditto, and fortunately they've faded over time.
Well, what do you think what is going to be the progression of the department as you move into the Dedman Life Sciences building?
Well, I think the research abilities are certainly going to be increased. And with the equipment of the rooms for the modern teaching, the potential is great. I see that there will be a challenge to have enough people to teach and do research, and how those two will balance. Because were I to be coming here today, I would be under tremendous pressure for research productivity to be sure to get the grants to do the research. At the same time, you want the people to be productive in teaching. And so there's going to have to be a balance of those. And fortunately, I think the people are doing them well.
That has been, that is a statement of where every middle-sized private university is, I think, because our stock and trade at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level has been the relationship with students and the impact we have on students. And mixing that with the pressure for research, which is required for us to be recognized as a part of a peerage, is severe.
Yeah.
John, it has been a pleasure to visit with you, and
thank you, Jim.
We'll look forward to seeing what you and I said on tape.
Okay.